Well, while everyone is just coming in and some more people are coming in and settling down, just to welcome you into the space, I'm just going to play a piece of music. It's a song which was written by a good friend of mine here in Canberra called Johanna McBride, and it's called Dear Earth.
Start unmute.
So I always love that recording. Dear Earth, living Earth, will you be our home? We need to protect you, reconnect with you. Deep in our bones, you are our home, which I feel connects us deeply to our purposes here together. So welcome everyone. It's been marvellous to see all the registrations coming in for this event, and I know we have people from around Australia and also from other parts of the world, and I hope you've managed to find us in amongst all the different time zones, and thank you very much for that. I would like to, just for all those in Australia and everyone, to acknowledge that here I'm meeting on the land of First Nations people here in Australia. I'm in the nation's capital, Canberra, and that is Ngunnawal and Ngambri land. And I pay my respects to those elders, past, present and emerging. And I pay respects to any First Nations and Indigenous people who are online today, and to the first owners of all the lands where people are joining today. And please, in the tradition of Zoom calls, feel free to put into the chat greeting and some information about where you're joining from. Thank you very much for coming to join us today. So, for those of you who, well, first of all, I should just note that Lynn has, I've got my colleague Lynn Stevens here online with me, and she's looking after any little tech issues. And a bit late, as we go along, she'll also be keeping an eye on the chat. I'll be keeping an eye on the chat too, and also invite our guest speakers to keep an eye on it too, so that we can respond to any questions that you might want to put in there and make this a little bit interactive. Lynn had just turned on the recording, so just to note that this meeting is being recorded. We will be showing it on speaker view largely. Actually, I'll just put it on speaker view right now. And so that you probably won't be seen, but if you are concerned about that, you can turn your video off. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Janet Salisbury, and I am the founder of the Women's Climate Congress here in Australia. And we're a movement of women who formed in January 2020 after the massive bushfires that we'd had here in Australia over that summer. And we've been building our network and our movement over the past 3.5 years. And we have many members now all over Australia, and we have quite a lively network overseas as well, which has been very exciting. And through many of these sorts of conversations with women here in Australia and overseas, we have developed our, as you can see behind me here on the screen, our Women's Climate Congress Charter for Change, which is a set of themed actions that we've distilled from the conversations with thousands of women that we've had well, there are 3 actions there around emergency, very urgent actions that we think are needed right now to bring about, to secure the climate, and we'll be talking about some of those sorts of things in our conversation tonight. And then there are other actions there which are around human and planetary well-being. I'm not going to say a lot about the Charter today because we've got our speakers here to talk about increasing ambition going into the international COP meeting and other international fora, but you can find it on our website, and I think Lynn is going to put the link into the chat, and I do commend you to go and have a look at it there. So it hasn't been really great news around the world lately. We've had we know that there's been seems to have been one catastrophic climate event after another coming on the news in Canada. We've had terrible wildfires in Hawaii. There was a terrible fire there, and we also have dire warnings here in Australia of potential bad bushfire seasons coming up again this summer and subsequent summers over the next few years probably. So the UN Secretary General has warned that the world has now moved from a period of global warming into global boiling, and our eyes are very much on the next international climate conference that's coming up, which is COP28, which is going to be held in the UAE in December 2023, and it is really time for the world to be taking very urgent actions to reduce carbon emissions and to bring about a just transition and adaptation measures before it really does get to be too late and these catastrophic events start. Well, we know that there will be more of them because we already have enough global warming to have affected the climate. So we're living in very urgent times. And today I'm joined by 3 women who are part of an international chorus of women and others bringing new ambitious agendas to COP and other international forums in an attempt to secure the climate. And it is really amazing to be part of a global movement of women who are really raising their voices and standing up and bringing these concerns to these international meetings at the moment. So I'm going to just very briefly introduce our 3 wonderful women that are joining us today, and then I'm going to ask them to sort of introduce themselves a little bit more, and I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. But just to briefly introduce, we have with us today Katrin Geyer, who is joining us from London, and she is the Environment Advisor at the International Secretariat of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which was founded in 1915 and is one of the longest standing women's peace organisations. It has consultative status with the UN, offices in New York and Geneva, and I think around about 40 country chapters. And WILFP works towards a vision of permanent peace built on foundations of freedom, justice, non-violent conflict resolution, human rights, and equality for all. And these principles also underpin what has become known as feminist foreign policy. And I think we'll hear a bit more about that from Katrin later. Incidentally, I should note, as I always do, that the foundation story of WILFP in 1915 was my inspiration for starting the Women's Climate Congress to bring some of these same principles to climate action on climate change and environmental management. And actually our Charter for Change is in part modelled on the resolutions from that 1915 event. So you can also look that up, look up WILFP and their founding story in 1915, and I think Lynn's going to put some links in the chat about that as well. So I also like to introduce Councillor Anna Reynolds, who's joining us from Hobart in Lutruwita, Tasmania. And Anna has been the Lord Mayor of Hobart since November 2018. And as Lord Mayor, she is a member of the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, which is the world's largest alliance of local climate leadership, and it represents about 12,500 cities and local governments. I was absolutely amazed actually by that when I read how many cities and local governments are involved in this network. It's amazing. And Anna was the first mayor in the world to pledge support for the Mayor's Declaration for a Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. And so she's going to tell us a little bit more about that. And then I'd like to introduce Natalie Sifuma, who is joining us from Kenya. And Natalie is a communications expert, and she has a wide range of experience across public and environmental health, education, gender equality and climate awareness. She's the head of communications at She Changes Climate, which is an international women's movement formed in 2020, a very similar time to when the Women's Climate Congress was formed. And they promote the crucial role of women in climate leadership, including through their 50-50 vision campaign for equal representation of women in all the COP negotiations. And they also advocate for a number of other issues around justice and ending of fossil fuels, which we'll probably hear a bit more about from Natalie a bit later as well. Those are our three wonderful speakers, and I do actually also, but I'm also now going to ask them to introduce themselves a little bit, and in a sort of somewhat personal way, because I have already mentioned in my introduction about the sort of rather catastrophic times that we're living in at the moment. And in fact, I had in the last couple of days written an article about how this is making me feel at the moment, and that article was published just today in a media outlet here in Australia called Women's Agenda, and I think Lynn is going to put a link, there's a link to that in the chat. So it certainly has impacted me greatly, and it makes, I'm not a person who's given to expressing anger about climate action, because I feel that anger isn't a very productive emotion, and I've spent my public life trying to promote collaboration and dialogue, which I still will continue to do, but just at the moment I feel, it's difficult not to feel a bit angry and worked up about what's happening. So I thought I would ask each of our speakers to spend a couple of minutes telling us a bit about themselves and about how they feel as women leaders at this time. So, Katrin, maybe I could go to you first.
Sure, thank you so much for having me. It's a great honor to be with all of you today, many of you across the globe on the other side. So I'm based in London, but originally from Germany. And to your question, you know, how I'm feeling as a woman working for climate justice, I feel very mixed emotions, and as you already outlined, the general landscape looks extremely bleak, with those most responsible not doing nearly enough, and with the ecological crisis rapidly deteriorating. And as you mentioned, we see this right now all the time in different parts of the world. However, I do also feel a sense of optimism and hope because of grassroots communities, feminists and climate activists all over the world resisting and organizing and mobilizing. And I think we do need to cherish all of these examples that we do see all the time, where we see that, you know, our joint action and collective power does work. I was most recently so happy to read about the referendum in Ecuador, where an overwhelming majority of Ecuadorians voted in favor of a ban on oil development in the Yasuni Amazon, which is one of the most biodiverse hotspots in the world, if not the most biodiverse area in the world. And this initiative was led by Indigenous peoples. So yeah, it's a mixed bag of feelings, but personally my sense of determination prevails. And also gatherings such as these today, help me in remaining steadfast, being just in a virtual space with so many wonderful women and feeling the sense of joint ambition and vision. So thank you very much for having me here today.
Thanks very much. Anna, shall we go to you now?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Hi from Hobart. For those of you who don't know, Hobart is the capital of Tasmania in the Southern Ocean, and we very much are a centre for Antarctic science and Southern Ocean science. These scientists live in our community, and we're very aware of their work. And I know that this last 6 months has been unprecedented in terms of the decline in sea ice in Antarctica, and very concerning changes happening in the Southern Ocean, which is the ocean where all of the world's oceans meet, and it actually is like the world's the process of the sea ice is really like the world's heart, in the sense that the sea ice and the salty water that comes from Antarctica actually drives all of the world's ocean currents, and so we're a little place, but we're very conscious of how close we are to this amazing system that is so important for the world's climate. And it is very, very concerning, and it does worry me for my children about the disruption that I think will be part of their lives. I do think that we have to stay motivated, though, and optimistic about how quickly things can change if we are determined enough and we're clever enough, because determination has to be combined with being strategic and clever about what we do and the action we take. So we have to, we do have to stay on track to make the changes that we need to make, and really try and slow down this damage and this change, and avoid the worst of that climate change could impact on the future. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anna. And if we can go to Natalie.
Sure. Thank you so much, Janet, and hello, everyone. Greetings, very warm greetings from Watamu, which is at the Kenyan coast. My name is Natalie Sifoma. I'm usually based in Nairobi, just decided to take a trip out of town to one of my favorite places in my country. And what's very interesting about where I am is that it's an area that's defined by baobab trees, which are known in local dialect as mbuyu trees. And throughout Africa, baobab trees are known as the tree of life because of how much they give us as people and how sacred they are in the Mijikenda community here in Kenya. So in many ways, for me, this is an honor to the ancestors whose livelihoods, whose good health was sustained by baobab trees. But over and beyond that, I'm the head of communications at She Changes Climate. And in a nutshell, what we do is address the climate crisis by taking head on the leadership challenge, which we believe is one of the reasons why there hasn't been sufficient progress in climate action. And so for me, it's just an honor to be here to be able to share more about what we're doing in the lead up to COP28 and just what this means for women, particularly in the global south. Thank you, Janet.
Thanks very much, Natalie, and to all our guests for your introductions. So I'm now going to sort of turn to the sort of topics that each of you bring and your particular interests, and so I might again go back to Katrin, because Katrin, you attended in June I think it's the subsidiary body for scientific and technical advice, SB 58 Climate Change Conference in Bonn, and this is one of the lead-up conferences coming into COP, you know, that is planning the agenda really for COP. And as the environmental advisor for WILFP is co-hosting. WILFP actually co-hosted a side event, which was on demilitarization, climate justice, and feminist perspectives, and are wanting these considerations to be included in the negotiation agenda at COP28. So can you tell us a little bit about that work and sort of what sort of response you're getting to it?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that question. So I think I might first take a step back and explain very briefly why we think the issue of demilitarization is so crucial to bring into the climate space. And then I can talk a little bit about what we've been doing specifically this year and going into COP28. So why do we advocate for demilitarization to be included in the COP agenda? Firstly, there's the issue of military emissions. Recent estimates suggest that militaries are responsible for 5.5% of global emissions. And just to put that into perspective, the total global emissions of the civilian aviation industry is just half that, at around 2.5%. Similarly, if we were to combine all of the world's militaries, they would be the fourth largest national emitter behind China, the US, and India. In addition to the emissions arising from military activity, there are also emissions from active conflict. If we take the example of the war in Ukraine, recent estimates calculated that the first year of war has triggered an increase of emissions that amount to the annual output of a country like Belgium. And obviously, this is just one example of one conflict, and we know that there are many more conflicts raging right now all over the world. And so the huge problem is that the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change does not oblige signatories to report on their military emissions. States are required to publish their annual greenhouse gas emissions, but the military emissions part is voluntary and most often not included at all. And so what this means is that there's this military emissions gap currently where there's no transparency and therefore no accountability for military's greenhouse gas emissions. The second reason why we're advocating for demilitarization is because military exercises, as well as weapons testing and use, as well as active conflict, they all destroy ecosystems. They destroy carbon sinks, which includes deforestation. These activities decimate biodiversity, they pollute water, air, and soil. And I just want to mention two important facts here. I think it's important to note that the environmental damage caused by military exercises and weapons testing during so-called peacetime exceeds that of wars themselves. And similarly, military training areas cover 5 to 6% of global land surface, which is roughly the same land surface area as the United States. And so next to the destruction arising from active conflict, there are also constantly military exercises in large expanses of fragile land on the oceans and in airspace. And all of these spaces are bombed and polluted and thereby exacerbate the climate crisis and environmental destruction. Another way that militarization is crucially linked to the climate crisis is military spending. Last year, global military spending rose to an all-time record high of $2.24 trillion. And so why is this an issue? Firstly, it's been found that there is a correlation between an increase in military spending and an increase in emissions. So the higher the military spending, the higher the emissions. Secondly, every dollar that's spent on the military takes away resources to tackle the climate crisis, including gender transformative climate action. Importantly, the G20, so the wealthiest nations in the world, account for the vast majority of military spending at 87%. However, many of us, I think, are aware of the fact that those same states still haven't managed to keep their promise of providing $100 billion per year of climate finance for low-income countries. And between 2013 and 2021, the world's wealthiest nations were spending 30 times more on military power than on tackling the climate crisis. And so what this means is that wealthy countries currently waste over $2 trillion on powering a death machinery, both for humans and the planet, while at the same time, they're unable to find even a tiny fraction of these resources to tackle the greatest existential threat to humanity. Another aspect of militarization and how it's linked to conflict and climate is the fact that conflict weakens communities' and governments' abilities to mitigate and adapt to the climate crisis. So next to the horrendous suffering and pain that arises from conflict, it also destroys the foundation of society's livelihoods. It pushes people into poverty and leads to forced displacement, etc., with disproportionate impacts on marginalized communities, such as women and queer people. And so the main takeaway here is that conflict-affected folks aren't really able to prioritize climate issues when they're trying to rebuild their lives from rubble, and they need to invest scarce resources in the reconstruction and rebuilding of their communities. So I hope I gave a really quick, snapshot of the ways that militarization is exacerbating the ecological crisis and why we think that it's important to bring in the issue of demilitarization. And I just want to briefly emphasize the concept of demilitarization. So I think it's clear that, and most people, most would agree, that the world's militaries must rapidly and urgently decarbonize. But this frankly looks extremely unlikely to happen at the speed and the urgency at which it is required, as there are currently no viable alternatives for the huge amount of fuel that is currently required for fighter jets, warships, and tanks, and all of the other devices and things that the military requires. But even if the military were green, it would still not be enough to address today's most pressing issues. And why is that? Firstly, the green militaries would still consume vast public and natural resources at the detriment of all other pressing issues, including the climate crisis or gender inequalities. Another issue is that militaries have framed the climate crisis as a threat multiplier. And this framing allows for responses to the climate crisis to be securitized and militarized. Think, for example, of militarized borders to keep refugees away who are fleeing climate disaster in their countries. And lastly, we see militaries as violent, oppressive, and patriarchal institutions that seek to maintain dominance and control through the threat of or the use of violence. And they are really, their purpose is, they exist because they seek to maintain the status quo. And the status quo is a capitalist and patriarchal system that benefits a small elite and harms the rest of the world, the majority of people, as well as the planet. And it seeks to protect precisely those entities and policies that have caused this crisis in the first place. So I don't know if I should go into what we've been doing specifically in the COP space now, or if we should. Oh, sorry, you're on mute, I think. Janet, we can't hear you, sorry.
Yeah, sorry, I think we'll just hear from the other two and then we'll come back and follow up a couple more questions. Thank you. Okay, well, I might go to to Anna now, I think, actually. Anna, I mentioned before about the Global Covenant
Sure.
Mayors for Climate.
Sure.
I just wonder whether you can tell us a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So cities have been taking action on climate change for many years, and in fact, I think many people say that it's the news that they see from cities around the world taking action on clean energy, clean transport, greening and bringing nature into their cities, adapting to deal with changes in climates. It's that sort of action, that on the ground practical action, that is really what the community needs to see to feel that sense of hope and connection to the climate change solutions. And really that's what city governments are doing in every corner of the world, which is really inspiring and exciting. But it's so important that we also work together to push the agenda of the national governments who have so much impact on the international treaty and national laws. It's often the national governments and things like subsidies for fossil fuels that make our jobs of making our cities zero carbon cities, make it that quite a bit harder. So mayors do collaborate across nations, but they also collaborate internationally to ensure that the voices of local communities, local governments and cities are heard, and that we are putting forward the next ambitious asks to national governments, because what we find is that many mayors in countries are more progressive on climate change and have a more ambitious goal for climate action than their national governments do. And that's it's really important to harness that incredibly positive energy in cities. So one of the projects that I've been working on is to try and bring ambitious mayors who have high ambitions for climate action, bring their voices together to help try and advance the campaign for a fossil fuel proliferation treaty. Now, this treaty campaign is a really exciting campaign that's been around just for a couple of years. And it's really based on the idea that for decades, our governments have been setting climate targets for emissions and trying to reduce the demand for fossil fuels, but it's not working fast enough. And there hasn't been enough focus on fossil fuels, oil, gas and coal, and the plans of that sector, the plans that they have to expand production at all levels, that will just reduce in a catastrophic level of climate change if their ambitions are realised. So we do need an international treaty to spur that global shift away from oil, gas and coal. And the current climate treaty does not even mention fossil fuels. So we really need a treaty that is focused very much on that transition. The transition needs to be organised, it needs to be fair, it needs to be effective. And international treaties have been used to address global threats before, and it can be used again for the phase out of fossil fuels. So it's a really important campaign. It is a campaign at this stage that's supported by different city governments, and also certain countries and subnational actors and companies have endorsed this campaign. If you put into Google fossil fuel treaty, you'll find out all about it. But we're trying to build a list of 200 mayors in really strategic cities around the world that will help the campaign to push national governments to sign on to advance this treaty. And Australia is one of those nations, and it's really important that we, as mayors with ambitions for strong climate action, work together across Australia to try and raise the profile of this treaty with our national government and push them to actually back the idea of having a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. So that's the work that I've been doing with that project, and it's just one aspect of the city advocacy that mayors are doing around the world, but I think it is quite a strategic one because we've really have to focus in on the phase out of oil, coal and gas as soon as possible. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much for that, Anna. Now, I know that, I'll just say briefly that Anna might have to leave this meeting a little bit before the end, so maybe after we've heard from Natalie, we'll come back if there's any sort of follow-up from what you've told us, but thank you very much for that. So I'll just bring in Natalie, who actually also attended the SB58 conference in Bonn that I mentioned before. So there she was with the She Changes Climate delegation, and I think they met a number of other country delegations talking about their promotion of 50-50 women representation and asking countries to sign up to a pledge that they will be taking women in their delegations. But I also noticed, Natalie, that you moderated a session about the power of international law to address climate change as well. So I just wonder if you can come and tell us some of about these initiatives, particularly the She Changes Climate initiatives. I know they also have some other initiatives, and especially in relation to significance for women in the global south.
Great, thank you so much. And just hearing Anna speak, hearing Katrin speak, I see how you've brought together three people who are part of organizations and movements, campaigns that are working sort of in parallel to each other. And really going back to your question earlier about, sort of what the feeling is, I think from this conversation so far, that at least from my end, there's a lot of hope. But really just to zero in on what She Changes Climate has been doing, ours really starts from seeing that we are facing a planetary emergency, a triple crisis for climate, for people and nature, and really wanting to address that. So of course, the impacts of climate change are already being felt by millions of people around the world, from more frequent natural disasters. I know in Africa, there's a lot of floods, there's cyclones, there's drought, and there's heat waves in Northern Africa, for instance. And of course, that comes with food and water shortage as sort of a secondary effect. And then women in particular are more affected and are 14 times more likely to die during extreme weather events. So they often stay behind to look after the young ones or the elderly, especially in countries in the global south. And they don't always have access to resources, information, technology, for instance. One case study that always comes to mind is from the 1991 Bangladesh floods, where 90% of the victims were actually women. Today in Pakistan, from what I hear, there's women who are being taught how to swim just to sort of reduce the risk of, being vulnerable during floods. But, also as She Changes Climate, we like to look at the statistics and see how the climate crisis does boil down to a leadership crisis. So what we found from our research is that since COP1 in 1995, only 5 women have been appointed as COP presidents. This is in 28 years, and for us to still be having a conversation about gender just goes to show how we still have systematic gaps and systematic challenges, and we want to step in to address, of course, rallying public support along the way. If we are to look at COP27, which happened last year, only 36% of the delegates were women, and only 20% of heads of country delegations were women. This clearly shows that there is a gap in gender, especially looking at the fact that women are most affected. But here's how we also come in to offer a solution. We're advocating for at least 50% of women at all levels of decision-making, starting with the COP presidency. And we realize that our approach is not in a way designed to attack the current way of governing and everything, but really just advocating for a co-leadership model where a man and a woman are co-chairing COP, but also in all country delegations. So we've been calling on governments to appoint at least 50% of women on their country delegations attending COP28 later this year. And so we have the policy side of things, or our ways of working include, sort of top down on policy and advocacy. So reaching out to people who are in positions of power and setting up new standards for women's political engagement. At the same time, we're also raising public awareness and growing the movement through a bottom-up mobilization, through public communications. This is where our campaigning is coming in. So really just bringing more people to be part of this global campaign and movement that we're advocating for by, providing resources and educating on what's happening. And then finally, which is one of the things that we're very excited about also as She Changes Climate, is that we provide financial support, training, and mentorship opportunities to women, particularly those with initiatives in the Global South. So this is women from different parts of the world who are, working with other women in local communities, who are youth advocates in marginalized communities. So it's really just a lot of things happening, but we are ultimately guided by the fact that we understand that women are most affected by climate change, but also play a critical role in climate solutions. And so we're seeing the importance of women empowerment and doing what we can to empower these women. So what ultimately this means for women in the Global South, if I'm to contextualize it in the sense of COP28's focus areas, which are energy, finance, inclusion, and nature is, and I think we can see for those who are conversant with COP28 and how the high-level champions are going and what's being focused on, is that with the co-leadership model that we are advocating for, I think women will no longer be the last ones to be considered in as far as access to sustainable and affordable renewable energy and access to resources. Finance and tech will be made available to them so that they can start and scale up projects that they have either been running as passion projects or as a means of survival. And then there'll be continuous access to natural resources and indigenous wisdom that comes with preserving nature. So those are just a couple of things that also come to mind and align with the work that we are doing at She Changes Climate. But yeah, we're just rallying as many people to really understand why we need, women's voices, that diverse perspective in climate leadership and climate action. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you to all three of you for bringing those three different threads together from that different work that you're doing. Now I know that Anna doesn't have very much more time, so I might just turn to her for a moment and think about that. One of the things that Natalie just mentioned there was women bringing solutions is a very important part of that. That it's not only the women being at the table in numbers, but it's about women bringing the solutions. And I just wondered whether in your work with the mayors, whether you feel that women, I don't know whether are there more women that have been involved in this global climate action, or how does it work with women bringing their solutions to the table in that forum that you're working with? Sorry, you're on mute, and I'm just trying to unmute you. Don't know why I can't unmute Anna now.
Thank you, Janet. I don't think I don't have the data about how many women mayors are involved with the Global Covenant of Mayors compared to male mayors, but what I do know is that local government is certainly a more accessible level of government to women and has greater, in many countries, much higher representation of women in local government than in national governments. And it's also a really useful stepping stone for women who are keen to go from being an activist and an advocate and a campaigner into a decision-making role where they will, can set laws, can set budgets, for climate solutions. So I do, whenever I get a chance, I do encourage people to think about you can be a campaigner and a decision maker. We do, I think, as Natalie said, the climate crisis is a leadership crisis, and we desperately need more very strong climate advocates in all positions of leadership in national governments, state governments, and local governments. And so, the more good climate activists that get into those elected roles, I think we will see faster action. And a good place to start is certainly in local government, both because there's really practical things that you can do for climate solutions, but also because it is a way to really build up experience in the process of being in government.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And I might just return maybe to Katrin for a minute, because you were going to tell us a little bit about the uptake of what you were telling us about the demilitarisation agenda that WILF is bringing by in relation to COP, and whether that is going to be something that can come onto the agenda there. I must say that one of the things I wrote about in my article that I mentioned earlier is it does bother me that when we're faced with all of these climate catastrophes, and there's been so little response from world leaders, you'd think that nothing's happening, they're just getting on with business as usual. But when there's any kind of little military action, something happens anyway. A drone over the US or something, there's massive sort of response, and I just think, well, what's going on? Why isn't there the response to climate? These catastrophic events, we seem to be walking into worse situation, but there's no response. Anyway, I'll pass over to you, Katrin, to just tell us whether this is being taken up as an issue to be.
Yeah, so I have a few things to say on that. So I think what we are doing,
because we've got
oh God, okay, I'll what we're trying to do as WILP is really to build a strong foundation across all of the different coalitions and civil society movements that are contributing to the COP process. And so one part of that is that WILF is part of the Women and Gender constituency, which is one of the 9 stakeholders groups of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And the WGC is really working to ensure women's voices and their rights are embedded in all processes and results of the UNFCCC framework. So we just launched a working group within the Women and Gender constituency on demilitarization, and we're really trying to build a strong movement and develop our strategy and advocacy within this working group. But the idea is also to go beyond the Women and Gender constituency and bring in other constituencies and other stakeholders, such as the Climate Action Network. In terms of the response, so there is now more awareness of the impacts of conflict and military and conflict emissions because of the war in Ukraine. And because of that, Ukraine actually has taken up that topic already at COP27, and they have co-hosted a couple of events on conflict emissions. So there is some attention around this, which is good. It's a good entry point. However, for WILP, it's not enough to just talk about conflict emissions, but we really need to look at the entire into all of the aspects that we mentioned, that I mentioned earlier. And just lastly, I think this year is a great opportunity to really raise the issue of demilitarization, because at COP28, for the first time, peace is an official theme on the official agenda of sorry, and I'm really trying to rush and just stumbling over my words. But so yeah, there's a unique opportunity this year to amplify the issue of demilitarization, and we will be strategizing in this working group how to best use that day to raise awareness on the topic. But honestly, I don't see the issue of demilitarization to be included in negotiations at this COP. It's a longer term process, unfortunately.
So all of the women that are on this call now, can be taking this issue up with their country governments, yeah. Okay, now I'm just, before I go back to Natalie again, I can see there's a lot of exchanging of information going on the chat, and a lot of people saying it's great to be hearing from all these, it's very empowering to be hearing from these women doing all these things. Have I missed anything in the way of questions, Lynn?
No, there's a lot of comment on how great it is to connect and on the importance of women's leadership, and one comment on the importance of expressing anger and grief in order for us to be able to work together effectively. Yeah. But there's a lot of interaction happening on the chat, which is really great. And lovely to see so many international visitors today. Feel free to join the Women's Climate Congress if you'd like to stay in touch with us.
Yeah. So I'll just, maybe I'll just go back to Natalie for a minute. How do you see all of these actions of women sort of coalescing? I feel really excited when I feel part of this big global movement of women, and the work that She Changes Climate is doing is always very inspiring. I think there's also a plan to try and get a multi-stakeholder dialogue happening at COP28. So how do you see these actions coming together, Natalie? Do you want to add some further comment?
Yes, absolutely. So really just going back to one of the comments in the chat about just sharing the aspect of grief and the reality. I think for me, one of the intentions I walked into my role at She Changes Climate with as a comms professional was to bring the aspect of storytelling as a tool for social change. And as a storyteller, which is one of the many hats that I wear, I see myself as a conduit. And so as I'm telling the stories of those either most affected by climate change or who are working with people at the front line, it's really just a story to show their reality, as well as to show the key values that they hold dear. So in as much as they're facing these crises, they are still portraying resilience. They are still, hard at work in rebuilding, whether it's their communities, their families. More often than not, it's the women who are doing this work. And so I think that we should also really try and pay attention to how powerful stories are. And I know that in Africa, this is something that's, ingrained in us. Storytelling was how information, indigenous knowledge was passed down through generations. So that's one thing that I just wanted to share on that. But moving on to the aspect of COP28, I would say that She Changes Climate. We are, obviously, I think we were surprised, but also not too surprised that at COP28, there's only half a day that's been dedicated to gender, which is, quite unfortunate to say the least, but we do want to rally as much public support as we can in the lead up to COP28 and be, again, just a channel through which people on the outside can be connected to what's happening on the inside. And so right now we are in a space where we're working with a comms agency, really just to make sure that information that's happening in there is made accessible to people who may not be conversant with COP, and really just bringing them with us as we work towards this vision, a 50-50 vision, man and women co-chairing. Beyond that, we are planning for a multi-stakeholder dialogue on either week 1 during Nature Day, and then we will have a small gathering with other women-led movements and others who share the same vision and mission as us on week 2 during Gender Day. So I would say that that's what we're going in with, but I would say that there is a lot of hope and positivity that future COPs will have that gender balance that we are looking for or looking forward to.
One of the questions I always ask is, the gender balance is incredibly important, and to get the 50-50 there, and I know you have your pledge that you're asking governments to sign up for, that they will be bringing that, but given the history of patriarchy and our systems are so geared towards, and our policies and everything are framed through that lens, is it enough? Like I sometimes think we need, 80% women in order to redress the balance. How do women really, and that was that's why I get excited about when I see women bringing these new agendas to COP, because that's like our agendas as well. I know men share these agendas as well, but women are bringing and forcing, and we need, and somehow need to have the floor to. So you know, how do we really make sure that women can bring their own policy lens? Is maybe I'll ask each of you to maybe answer that, and then, but in just about a minute, and then we'll wind up. Natalie, do you?
Yeah, how can women bring? I think it really comes, I've noticed that, you know, I mean, back at the beginning, you introduced She Changes Climate, which started 2 years ago out of frustration and as a campaign. But over the last 2 years, one of the things that's enabled us to grow beyond the UK, which is where, you know, sort of the She Changes Climate seeds were planted, was a lot of partnerships and collaborations. And also along the journey, we realized this is why also men need to see where we're coming from and be proactive sort of supporters of this movement, because we realize that that shared vision, that shared future requires both men and women, or women and men, to come together. So I would say that it's really, to go take a roundabout way of answering it, it's women, I think, just coming with more women, coming with more men who also understand, you know, just the importance of that diverse perspective. Yeah, I think that's how I would respond to that.
Thank you. And Katrin, do you have something to add on that?
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Natalie said. I think, and what you also hinted on, Janet, is, you know, we need to challenge patriarchy, and we need to communicate that patriarchy is harming everyone. It's harming men, women, non-binary people. It's harming everyone. And I think what's also important is that feminists really communicate clearly our vision of the alternatives to patriarchy, of the alternatives to capitalism, of the alternatives to the military. Because I think if we can't, and we have all of these visions, we have them, we know the world that we want to build, but communicating really concretely what this world will look like also helps, I think, mobilizing more people and really making sure that women's, you know, perspectives and visions are made a reality.
Yeah, thank you. Well, we are sort of getting really close to our time, and so I want to really thank all of our guest conversationalists today, Katrin, Natalie and Anna as well, who has unfortunately had to leave us a little bit early, but for bringing all of those the news of those different initiatives and activities and the wonderful work you're doing. And yeah, it's just so great to be part of this international movement. We need to keep growing and growing and growing to be a massive chorus going forward before we get swamped by further climate events. So I can see that Lynn has put, so I'll just, you know, do our Zoom applause for our wonderful speakers. Thank you very much. And I saw that Lynn put something in the chat about how to join the WCC, and also you've got links in there to WILFP and to She Changes Climate, and if you're a mayor, to the Mayor's Initiative. And so please, you know, save the chat. I think anyone can save the chat and go and look up those things afterwards and follow them up. Contact your local government in wherever you are in the world to pass on what we've been talking about here today, and to increase the voice for these ambitions that we've been talking about, these ambitious agendas, which are so needed. So, and I'm just going to conclude, I'm just going to hand over to Lynn, who is going to tell you a little bit about our next event, which is also an exciting global affair, and it's coming up in only 2 weeks' time. So, Lynn, would you like to just fill us in?
Yeah,
I'm going to share my screen and show you a picture.
You're going to share your screen?
Yes, I can. If I can just get rid of that.
Right, very quickly, our next event is on the 12th of September at 5 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. And it's actually based on a recently released UK report called Reconnection, Meeting the Climate Crisis Inside Out. And we have Amy Bristow and Professor Christine Wamsler, LEC, who will be talking about the importance of mindfulness and compassion if we're actually going to meet this climate crisis. I have put a link to how to register in the chat, and we'd love to see you along for that one as well. And I guess it actually does link into that comment about anger and grief and tuning into the internal development goals as well as the external ones. So thank you, Janet, for sharing, and thanks everyone for coming along.
Okay. Thank you everyone, and enjoy the rest of your evening if you're in Australia, the rest of your day if you're somewhere else in the world, and thank you again from the bottom of my heart for joining us for this event today. Goodbye.